The youngest children in the care of the parish went to Mrs. Mann's workhouse. The parish paid Mrs. Mann to buy food and clothes for the 26 children she looked after. She kept most of this money for herself. Most days the children ate very little. They never had baths, nor did they sit down for meals, unless Mrs. Mann was expecting a visit from Mr. Bumble, the parish inspector. One day, Mr. Bumble arrived at Mrs. Mann's unexpectedly. Mrs. Mann did not like surprises.
"Oh, how lovely to see you, sir," she said with a false smile. "Can I get you a drink and some cake?"
"Just a little," said Mr. Bumble, relaxing into Mrs. Mann's best chair. She opened a corner cupboard and took down a bottle of gin and a glass.
"Do you give the children gin, Mrs. Mann?" asked Bumble. "Yes, I do," replied Mrs. Mann. "I don't like to see them suffer, sir."
"No," said Mr. Bumble approvingly.
"You could not."
"You are a kind woman, Mrs. Mann."
"Everything for the children, sir."
"You feel as a mother, Mrs. Mann," said Mr. Bumble, swallowing half the glass of very strong gin. "And now to business. The child, Oliver Twist, is 9 years old today." "Bless him," said Mrs. Mann. She wiped a tear from her left eye with the corner of her apron. "The time has come for me to take him back," said Mr. Bumble. "He needs to start earning the money to pay for all that fine food he's been eating."
"A child is never hungry under my roof, Mr. Bumble."
"Indeed, Mrs. Mann. Those children don't know how lucky they are."
"I'll fetch him for you,"
said Mrs. Mann, leaving the room. Oliver was at that moment receiving an unwanted birthday present in the coal cellar. 2 boys were punching and kicking him.
"Clean him up,"
Mrs. Mann ordered. The boys stopped punching Oliver. They began washing his pale face violently. Mrs. Mann then led the thin, miserable boy back to Mr. Bumble. "Will you go along with me, Oliver?" said Mr. Bumble in a majestic voice. Mrs. Mann was standing behind Bumble's chair, shaking her fist at Oliver. Her face was furious. "Will she go with me?" asked poor Oliver. "Mrs. Mann is far too busy looking after the children here," replied Mr. Bumble. "But she will come to see you sometimes." Oliver never wanted to see Mrs. Mann again, but he said nothing. Mr. Bumble handed Mrs. Mann some coins. Mrs. Mann gave Oliver a piece of bread and some very cheap clothes. With the slice of bread in his hand, Oliver walked away with Mr. Bumble. Under his little brown cap, his eyes filled with tears as the cottage gates closed behind him. "I am alone in the world," he thought. "Nobody wants me."